Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a really sharp panel of witnesses. We're grateful for you guys being here. As we've noted, the topic of removing the Monell Doctrine has most recently come up during conversations surrounding the conduct of law enforcement officers and police reform. Some people suggest that the Monell Doctrine provides nearly complete liability protection for state and local governments that employ bad actors. Others are concerned that eliminating the Monell Doctrine would put a major strain on the budgets of small towns and municipalities and would yield a minimal real-world impact. Let me ask my question of Mr. Mangual. Since the summer of 2020, of course, there have been several legislative proposals that would eliminate the Monell Doctrine entirely. You've touched on this, but let me just ask you directly. Do you agree with the premise that police officers are somehow misbehaving because they don't have any financial skin in the game, and that eradicating the Monell Doctrine would create a noticeable impact on how police act?
I do not agree with that characterization of the situation on the ground. I mean, as I've mentioned, if you look at a 1983 litigation filed against individual officers, those cases are very, very often successful. Qualified immunity functions as an effective bar in less than 4% of cases. I mean, just look at my city of New York. There's a database of lawsuits filed against the NYPD in federal court, maintained by the Legal Aid Society, that contains about 2,400 cases. If you filter out those cases by disposition, only 74 were disposed of in favor of the police defendants, which is still about 3%. So the idea that it's civil rights litigation protections that are providing a real financial shield to police officers is wrong, especially because even when officers are successfully sued in their individual capacities, the municipalities are already picking up the tab. But the biggest reason to be skeptical of this, as I mentioned in the front part of my testimony, is that when officers are out in the field, they are making decisions in very rapidly unfolding situations that don't lend themselves to legal analysis. The idea that police officers are faced with a criminal suspect and then are engaging in the sort of analysis to identify what their potential legal exposure might be is just incongruous with the reality of those situations in which officers are acting based on intuition and training.
Thanks for that. You also talked a little bit about the unintended consequences of eliminating Monell would have on small localities' budgets, and you talked about this destabilizing of the insurance markets. And I think you said that it's led to some small towns already completely disbanding their police departments, which is just shocking. And then we've got this recruitment crisis in law enforcement as well. Would you comment a little bit more about what a profound effect this would have in this arena?
Sure. So there's some scholarship that I cite in my written testimony done by Professor John Rappaport that explains how in the 1980s, small municipalities, because of destabilization in the insurance market, did in fact completely disband their police departments. More recent research by Kenneth Abraham shows that a lot of those patterns of destabilization are starting to appear again over the last few years. Part of that has to do with the way insurance markets are actually reading the tone of our national debate about policing and police reform and the attention that this issue is getting. At the same time, there's been a big proliferation in the availability of cell phone cameras, et cetera, which not only provides different kinds of evidence that may be weighed differently by a jury, but also that places a lot of new political pressures on municipalities not to fight cases too hard, which means that the legal exposure might grow. As that happens, most cities, big cities and states are able to self-insure against this kind of expenditure, but smaller towns don't necessarily have that infrastructure in place. So a shift to complete municipal liability in all of these cases might actually present some real problems for smaller municipalities who won't be able to afford the kind of insurance that's already contracting in terms of the scope of its coverage and increasing in terms of its costs.
Thank you for that. I mean, speaking of political pressure, I think that we have to remember that calls to curtail or abolish qualified immunity in the Monell Doctrine, they had to be considered in the context of today. And that's, that many of our Democrat colleagues have a years-long effort to take funding and resources away from police departments. And these calls have even come from some members of this subcommittee. So many large jurisdictions around the country, like Seattle, have defunded their police departments. And in 2020, the city cut its police budget by 17%. What are the effects? Just last week, Seattle Times reported the department is no longer investigating new sexual assault cases because the unit in charge of those matters is so depleted. These are real-world effects, and I think this should cause everybody concern. So I'm grateful for the thoughtful discussion. There's a lot of thoughtful debate that needs to be had about all this. I'm out of time, so I yield back.